Tonight, the royals and thousands of strangers united on the streets in silent tributes for the Queen. Rehearsals under the cover of darkness, Buckingham Palace ready for Her Majesty's return. The Australians and the Perth professor chosen to join the Prime Minister at the Queen's funeral.
Also tonight, the former Perth policeman accused of violent sex crimes against women. A jury warned they'll have to sit through disturbing and graphic videos. Floating floorboards, a Kinross rental property at the centre of its own flood emergency. Cancelled without warning, a Baldivis boy in pain turned away from the Children's Hospital at the last minute. And the chase is on. A premiership star is coming home, but will he join the Dockers or the Eagles?
This is 7 News with Rick Arden in Perth and Susanna Carr live from London.
Good evening. In the coming hours, the Queen will begin her journey home to Buckingham Palace. Overnight, her children, led by King Charles, followed the hearse carrying her coffin to Edinburgh's St Giles's Cathedral. Thousands of Scots lined the street in silence, honouring Her Majesty. Princess Anne was the first royal woman to take part in the Vigil of Princes, as she and her brothers stood guard over the casket. For now, the Queen remains in the Scottish capital, where right through the night and into the morning, members of the public have filed past paying their respects. One last goodbye for a sovereign seen very much as one of their own.
In Edinburgh's St Giles Cathedral, 4 children who've lost their mother and father in the space of barely 18 months. The King, the Princess Royal, the Duke of York, the Earl of Wessex, Charles, Anne, Andrew and Edward, standing vigil at their mother's coffin. As Her Majesty lies at rest. This is a royal tradition since the death of King George V, difficult as it must be. Earlier, the Queen's coffin was carried from the Palace of Holyrood House. To the sound of the new anthem that now hails her son, the King. Charles and his siblings escorted the Queen's hearse up Edinburgh's Royal Mile. This ancient thoroughfare, in places so narrow the crowds were so close to their Queen and their new King. His Majesty carrying his Field Marshal's baton presented to him by his mother 10 years ago. Alongside him, the Royal Company of Archers, officially the Sovereign's bodyguard in Scotland. In the background, minute guns. Fired every 60 seconds as the slow march climbed the hill.
A family that has so far been able to grieve in private must now share their pain with the public. Tens of thousands of people here in Edinburgh, millions right around the world.
It sort of underlines the fact that it's very much a family affair. And this is a day for their family and the family of the Commonwealth.
For those who came from across Scotland and across the seas to be here, it was a day they will never forget.
We've been here for two to 3 hours, I think, to see it.
Honouring a remarkable monarch.
You could feel the love in the crowd. Yep, magnificent woman.
A sentiment almost universal here. Almost. A lone protester shouted at Prince Andrew before being shouted down by the crowd and dragged away by bystanders and police. But there was barely an interruption. Carried into St Giles by soldiers from the Royal Regiment of Scotland, the coffin adorned with a wreath of flowers, rosemary, white heather and chrysanthemums. And then the 16th century Crown of Scotland. This nation, once a standalone kingdom, today farewelling perhaps its most Scottish monarch in centuries.
Here at St Giles, John Knox confronted Mary, Queen of Scots, Here James VI argued about liturgy. Here Oliver Cromwell preached. Here Parliament sometimes met. Here our late Queen received the honours of Scotland, and the stone of destiny rested on its return to Scotland. We are graced by the presence of the King and members of the royal family.
And later, the Queen was joined by members of the public allowed to file past. They will for 24 hours.
Let's go live to Hugh Whitfeld in Edinburgh. And Hugh, are many mourners still queuing to pay their respects to the Queen?
So thousands of Scots and people who've travelled much further have been lined up through the night and into the morning here. The queue is moving pretty well, but it is certainly growing, stretching for more than 2 kilometres through the streets of Edinburgh's Old Town. People of all backgrounds, all ages. For many, passing by Her Majesty's coffin is an emotional moment. Scotland's history is deeply rooted in its relationship with the Crown, its own stories of Scottish kings and queens. Their new monarch, Charles, has spent the night here in Edinburgh at the Palace of Holyrood House. He is currently on his way to the airport to continue his journey through the United Kingdom. Princess Anne remains here in the Scottish capital as well. She will soon escort her mother back down to London. So.
Thanks, Hugh Whitfeld in Edinburgh. And let's go to Chris Reason here at Buckingham Palace, where the Queen's coffin will arrive overnight. Chris, how are the preparations?
Yeah, good evening to you, Sue. Well, look, this is a simply enormous operation, the likes of which this country has never seen. From the moment the late Queen Elizabeth arrives back here in London, the levels of grief that we have been seeing in Britain will go to simply another level. What we've been watching in Scotland will be dwarfed by what happens here in London. Now, we know when she arrives at the airport, the roads and streets from there to here, Buckingham Palace, will be lined again with mourners. She'll be coming down this road here, Constitution Hill, 10 to 8 local time, going to Buckingham Palace, and then tomorrow we begin the procession up the Mall. It is going to be an extraordinary moment. She goes into Westminster, 4 days laying in state, an operation which they were planning for under the cover of darkness just this morning.
Buckingham Palace only hours ago. After 70 years of protecting the Queen, Coldstream Guards and the Household Cavalry rehearse their last duties for Elizabeth. 75 beats a minute, funeral tempo. At Wellington Barracks, more preparations for the saddest of duties. A prop casket in black borne by gun carriage. Royal troops practice a step-perfect final salute. In London, security is tightening, preparations ramping up. The Queen returns here tonight and tomorrow will begin a final journey through her empire's capital. It will be timed to the minute.
The Queen's coffin will be placed on a gun carriage at Buckingham Palace, leaving at 2:22 p.m, making its way slowly up the Mall with members of the royal family and the King slowly following behind. The procession will happen in silence, but for the bells of Big Ben and the minute guns of the King's Troop Artillery.
From the state funeral for Sir Winston Churchill in 1965 to Diana's funeral in 1997, Charles and the City of London are sadly practised in regal farewells.
The scene on London's Lambeth Bridge this afternoon.
Hundreds of thousands turned out for the funeral of the Queen Mother 20 years ago, but it was the Queen's father who was the last sovereign to lie in state.
And following were the heavily veiled, grieving figures of the Queen Mother and Princess Margaret.
And now it's Elizabeth's turn. Countless mourners will come to pay their respects, packing a history-filled route.
It will take precisely 38 minutes for that gun carriage to reach here, Westminster Hall. The coffin will be carried inside, placed on a catafalque before a short memorial service attended by the King and members of the royal family. And then they will throw the doors open to the public for 4 days of lying in state.
The queue has already started This woman, first in line.
I just want to make sure that I get the chance to pay the last respect.
The route takes in some of the most famous sights of London, past St James's Palace, up to Horse Guards Parade, through the Archway into Whitehall, past number 10 Downing Street, Big Ben, the Palace of Westminster, stopping at Parliament's oldest building.
It's a route King Charles knows well. He drove an almost identical path for his historic address to Parliament. But tomorrow he'll have to walk it on what will be a profoundly difficult day.
While up to 1 million mourners will share that burden with him. In London, Chris Reason, 7 News.
An emotional King Charles has held back tears as he faced Britain's Parliament. He's now preparing to make a historic visit to Northern Ireland.
Come one, come all for the King's Speech Mark II. Waiting in the ancient walls of Westminster Hall, a who's who of British politics and power, 1,500 Lords and MPs. After the very human response to the Queen's death, now would come the constitutional one. From Buckingham Palace came Camilla and the King for his inaugural address to one of the oldest institutions of all.
As I stand before you today, I cannot help but feel the weight of history which surrounds us and the tangible connections to my darling late mother we see all around us.
Among them, these precious glass panes, most recently restained for the Queen's Diamond Jubilee.
Like the light that shines through this memorial window, Her late Majesty's magnificent achievements will live on by permanently illuminating and enriching our lives and our national discourse.
From the Speakers of Parliament's two houses, a nation's grief.
Deep as our grief is, we know yours is deeper.
And the King's reply.
As Shakespeare says of the earlier Queen Elizabeth, she was a pattern to all princes living. She set an example of selfless duty, which, with God's help and your counsels, I am resolved faithfully to follow.
Like all great events, it went without a hitch. And while the King will be back, the Queen herself, seen here many times over many years,
my Lords, members of the House of Commons,
will visit once more as well when she lies in state in this great place 36 hours from now. In the coming hour, King Charles will arrive here in Belfast, his 40th visit to Northern Ireland, but his first as monarch. There will be a service of Thanksgiving at St Anne's Cathedral and meetings with some of his loyal subjects and senior politicians. At what is a time of deep political crisis in this country, local party leaders have put their differences aside to pay tribute to the Queen, describing her as a courageous and gracious leader who contributed significantly to peace and reconciliation here, hoping that the new King too will be able to bring people together. Sue?
Sarah Greenouch in Belfast, thank you. 10 everyday Australians were handed an extraordinary honour today. They've been invited to represent our nation at the Queen's funeral. They come from all walks of life, but have shown leadership in their fields. As Jeff Parry reports, our representative is a former WA Australian of the Year.
Professor Helen Milroy is one of 10 citizens chosen to represent everyday Australians. She's anything but everyday.
I actually had a phone call.